In a small provincial town, the local hospital was always a stronghold for emergency care. Among its ambulance crew worked John, a white paramedic with 10 years of experience. John was confident in his professional skills, but his reputation among colleagues left much to be desired. He had long been known for his cold and sometimes even arrogant attitude toward patients. Many noticed that his treatment of people often depended on their appearance or social standing. However, he always arrived at calls promptly, and no one could accuse him of negligence. That evening, a call came in. An ambulance was dispatched to a troubled part of town to assist a young black woman, pregnant and unconscious. Michelle, who was in her early 20s, lived in a modest apartment with her friend. At the time of the incident, they were preparing dinner when Michelle suddenly experienced sharp abdominal pain. She barely managed to ask for water before collapsing. Her frightened friend immediately dialed emergency services. John's crew arrived quickly, but as soon as he saw the location, a small old house in a neighborhood with a questionable reputation, his enthusiasm noticeably faded. Entering the home, he glanced at Michelle, who lay on the couch breathing heavily. Her skin was pale and her forehead was damp with sweat. Her friend explained the situation anxiously. She passed out. This isn't normal for pregnancy. She was complaining about pain recently. You need to take her to the hospital. But instead of getting to work immediately, John began asking questions that sounded more like an interrogation. "Does she have insurance?" he asked curtly, without stepping closer to the patient. "What insurance? She's barely breathing," the friend exclaimed indignantly. John glanced around the room, noticing the worn-out furniture and peeling wallpaper, and frowned skeptically. His disapproving gaze didn't go unnoticed by the friend. She jumped up, her frustration boiling over. "She needs to get to the hospital immediately. She could lose her baby." "We can't just transport everyone," John said dryly as he scrolled through his tablet to check previous calls. "If her condition is truly critical, we need confirmation." John's partner, Eric, a quiet and always diligent paramedic, exchanged an uneasy look with him. Feeling the tension, Eric stepped closer to Michelle to assess her condition, but John stopped him, gesturing to the clock. "We can wait for another crew. Maybe they can," John began, but Michelle's friend cut him off sharply. "Another crew? She might not survive until another crew arrives." Tears of despair glistened in her eyes, but John remained unyielding. The friend quickly grabbed her phone and began dialing. "What are you doing?" John asked suspiciously. "I'm calling her father. You'd better stay quiet until he gets here," she replied curtly, covering her face with her hand to keep her emotions in check. John scoffed, dismissing her words as unimportant, and turned away as if he hadn't heard her. He had no idea that this phone call was about to change everything. Michelle's friend frantically dialed her father's number. A calm but firm voice answered on the other end. "I'm listening." "Dr. Robertson, it's Tanya. It's Michelle. She needs to get to the hospital immediately. She's unconscious, and the paramedics refuse to take her." Tanya's voice trembled with anger and desperation. There was a tense silence on the line. Then a cold, stern voice responded, "I'm on my way. Tell them not to move." Meanwhile, John glanced irritably at Tanya, who was still speaking on the phone. "Who are you talking to?" he asked, suspicion in his tone. "To someone who's about to put you in your place," she snapped back but didn't elaborate. John smirked, turned away, and began typing something into his tablet. His partner, Eric, carefully leaned over Michelle to check her pulse and assess her condition. "Her blood pressure is dropping. We can't wait any longer," Eric said quietly. But John, as if not hearing him, continued entering information into the system. "We have protocols, Eric. We can't rush unless we're sure this is a real emergency. You know how it is. Some calls are just about getting a ride to the hospital," John replied dismissively. Eric frowned, but remained silent. He could clearly see Michelle needed urgent help, but he didn't dare go against his senior colleague. About 10 minutes passed. Tanya glanced at Michelle again. Her breathing was becoming more labored, and her face was pale. Tanya paced around the room, unsure of what to do. Then from outside, the sound of a car pulling up broke the tense silence. It wasn't an ambulance, but a black sedan, unassuming in appearance. A man stepped out, wearing a sharp business suit. His face was composed, but his eyes burned with icy fury. It was Dr. Robertson, Michelle's father and the chief physician at the hospital where John worked. Robertson strode confidently toward the house, flung the door open, and stopped, surveying everyone present. His piercing gaze landed on John, who instinctively straightened up, suddenly realizing this man was far more than just the patient's father. "What's going on here?" Robertson's voice was quiet but carried an undeniable authority. Tanya rushed to him. "Doctor, they're not doing anything. They're saying it's not urgent. Look at her, she's in terrible shape." Robertson approached the couch where his daughter lay. His face remained calm, but his eyes grew sharper. He turned to John. "Why isn't she already in the ambulance?" John felt his palms grow sweaty. Gathering his composure, he replied, "Sir, we're following standard protocols. We need to be certain that this isn't—" "Certain?" Robertson interrupted, stepping closer. His voice dropped, now cold as steel. "Are you seriously trying to explain to me how medicine works?" John faltered, mumbling something incoherent. Without waiting for an answer, Robertson turned to Eric. "Prepare her for transport immediately." Eric obeyed without hesitation, quickly gathering the necessary equipment. "And you," Robertson said, locking eyes with John, "should keep quiet if you have nothing meaningful to say." For the first time in a long while, John had no retort. He watched as Robertson took command of the situation with absolute confidence and calm, making John feel small and powerless. Michelle was carefully placed on the stretcher, and the crew, along with her father, headed to the ambulance. John trudged along behind them, still trying to process what had just happened. As the ambulance began to move, a heavy silence filled the cabin. Michelle lay on the stretcher, her breathing labored but stable. Eric focused intently on monitoring her vitals, avoiding eye contact with John, who sat across from him, pale and visibly shaken. Dr. Robertson stood nearby, observing John's every move with a cold, calm demeanor that sent shivers down the spine. John tried to focus on his tablet, pretending to log call details, but his hands trembled slightly. Eventually, the tension became unbearable, and he tried to regain his composure by addressing Robertson. "Sir, I'd like to clarify that my duty is to follow protocols. I couldn't be sure that—" Robertson raised a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. "Protocols, you say?" he repeated quietly, but the steel in his voice silenced John. "Protocols are meant to save lives, especially when it involves a pregnant woman. Or do you have your own standards that you believe are more important than my daughter's life?" John felt his face flush with heat. "No, of course not. I just—" he began, but his words trailed off under Robertson's piercing gaze. "Let me tell you something," Robertson continued, folding his arms across his chest. "I've been working at this hospital for 25 years, and during all that time, I've taught my staff one simple principle. Every life is valuable. It doesn't matter what someone looks like, where they live, or what resources they have. If you've chosen this field, you must be ready to see every patient as a person whose life deserves to be saved. Do you understand me?" John nodded, but his silence spoke louder than words. Meanwhile, the ambulance arrived at the hospital. Outside, a team of medical professionals awaited them, ready to act on Robertson's instructions. They swiftly and efficiently transferred Michelle onto a hospital stretcher and wheeled her toward the operating room. But for John, the ordeal was far from over. As Michelle disappeared behind the doors, Robertson turned to him. "Do you have anything you'd like to say to me?" John met his gaze, knowing that no excuse would suffice. All he could do was lower his eyes and mumble, "I made a mistake." "Mistakes cost lives," Robertson said coldly. "I won't allow someone who places their personal biases above the lives of others to continue working in my hospital." Robertson slowly stepped closer, his voice becoming quieter, but even more resolute. "Tomorrow morning, you will come to my office with your resignation, or I'll handle it for you." John didn't dare argue. He simply nodded and left, heading back to the ambulance without waiting for further instructions. Eric, still standing beside Robertson, looked at him with a mix of respect and gratitude. He knew that this man had just placed justice above all else. As the doors to the operating room closed behind Michelle, Dr. Robertson remained in the corridor, silently watching the medical team begin their work on stabilizing her condition. Tanya sat in the waiting area, arms crossed, silently praying. Her face still bore the traces of the terror she had endured, but now, a glimmer of hope shone in her eyes. Several hours later, Robertson emerged from the operating room. Tanya immediately jumped up, her voice trembling. "Is she okay?" Dr. Robertson smiled wearily and nodded. "Yes, her condition is stable and the baby is fine too. Thank you for your strength and determination." Relieved, Tanya sank back into her chair, tears of joy streaming down her face. Robertson left her to process her emotions and headed to his office. The next morning, as instructed, John arrived at Robertson's office. His face displayed a mix of shame and tension. Without saying a word, he handed over his resignation letter. Robertson silently took the paper, reviewed it, and signed it. "I hope you've learned something from this experience," Robertson said, looking him in the eye. "And remember, medicine is not just a job, it's a duty to serve people, not to judge them." John didn't respond, simply nodded and left the office. This marked the end of his career at the hospital. A few weeks later, Michelle was discharged. Both her health and the baby's were carefully monitored by the best specialists Robertson had assembled. She couldn't find words to express her gratitude to her father for always being there, and to Tanya for her determination that fateful night. At a small family gathering held to celebrate her recovery, Michelle turned to her father. "Dad," she said with a smile, "you've always been my role model. You not only saved me, but reminded me once again that a person must always remain human, no matter the circumstances." Robertson smiled and hugged his daughter. A few months later, Michelle gave birth to a healthy baby boy, whom she named Robert in honor of her father. The story spread throughout the hospital, serving as a poignant reminder of the importance of humanity and respect. For the hospital staff, it became a lesson now embedded in their work philosophy. In every person's life, there is a place for justice and kindness, and it's these qualities that make medicine a truly noble profession.